thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak today. Today I want to think about with you three authors, Guatemalan authors who are writing from about 1930 until the present day. And I want to think about how they grapple with issues of identity, particularly the sort of clash of cultures in Guatemala. And I want to think about that through the lens of translation. So in order to do the literature part, I want to do a little background part. So I'm going to start with that so we're all kind of on the same page. I want to talk for a minute just about translation. So when we think of translation, really, we think of interlingual translation. So we think of translation of a text from one language into another, right? However, if anybody who's translated knows that what we're doing is changing languages, but we're also shifting contexts. So we're shifting culture as well, and connotation, right? So we can think about translation more broadly as recontextualization. So we're moving ideas really from one context into another, and that includes language, but even within the same language, we can do that with concepts, right? The next kind of translation that I'll bring up in this talk is what's been called decolonial translation. And decolonial translation is really a practice of translation, be it from one language to another or within languages, that pushes against sort of the legacy of colonialism, against racism, against sexism, against discrimination, economic exploitation, etc. So if I talk about decolonial translation, we're talking about sort of a resistive kind of recontextualization, right? And the last kind of translation I want to kind of think through today is self-translation, and I think we can think about it in two modes. Self-translation is first and foremost the interlingual translation, which is from one language to another, of a person who writes in one language and then translates his or her own text into another language. So self-translating your own work, right? However, if we take this broader view of translation studies, we can kind of think of self-translation as the self of the translator that ends up in a translated text. So we can think about translators or writers who are adapting, recontextualizing concepts, and what we see in their final work is a reflection of their context, the time period in which they live, the politics that they're circulating in themselves, right? So these are kind of big, lofty translation concepts that we're going to be thinking about a little bit today. So in terms of context for Guatemala, right here we have the Guatemala linguistic map. So Guatemala is a pretty small country. It's about the size of Tennessee. And what's interesting about it is that every different color indicates it's a different ethnic group and language. The majority of these languages are Maya languages. However, you see Castilian Spanish, Spanish down here in the purple, some over here. So there are pockets of Spanish speakers as well. And there's a lot of Spanish within the Maya areas as well. But there's not a ton of Maya in the urban centers, which are right here, some. But the point of just taking a look at this map is that we can imagine the conflict through the centuries that has arisen due to these different identities, different languages, and the kind of cultural conflict between them. So real quick context politically of Guatemala is colonial period, to a bunch of dictatorships, to 10 years of democracy, to a bunch more dictatorships, a 36-year civil war, and then the peace accords, right? So that's kind of a rapid view of kind of Guatemalan political history. So what I think is important, kind of where we're going to begin talking about our authors today, is in this democracy period, about 1944 to 1954, which is the 10 years of spring. Governments in Guatemala, which were the Arevalo Arbenz governments, that came as a response to the successive series of dictatorships from the colonial period to 1944, but which ended, is sort of bookended with a successive series of dictatorships that follows 1954, and that leads into the 36-year armed conflict and genocide of Maya communities that ends in 1996 with the peace accord. So we're going to kind of traverse this period right here when looking at our authors today. Given all of the cultural conflict from the colonial period on, if we look at a genealogy of literary depictions of Mayas, mainly from Criollo or Spanish descended, and then Ladino or Mestizo, Western identified writers, the sort of trope or myth of the indigenous Maya is that they're magical, they're mythical, and they exist in a kind of dream world, which means there's no contemporary present Maya. The Mayas that do exist are of the past. They don't exist now. And this is still fairly prevalent in Guatemala, but in literature we're starting to really see this change. And I want to look at 3 authors that work to change some of these ideas. The other concept that's going to be central to this presentation is the concept of Nahualismo. Now, are the Nahuales sort of a little bit familiar? The Nahual is a Mesoamerican epistemic construct in which, depending on the day of the calendar year you're born, you are automatically at birth associated with an element in the natural world, which could be a mountain, a rock, an animal, a plant, a tree, right? And that thing is your Nahual. However, the Nahual and you are related. You correlate. The human is both the human and the Nahual at the very same time. And there's an inherent duality in everybody's identity in the Maya episteme. So you can imagine how this is going to conflict with a Western notion of national identity, right? The Nahual can also be kind of thought of as an intimate double. So in Western literature, we think about the doppelganger, right? The double that is kind of an unknown or distanced reflection of yourself, or a you in a different realm. But in the Maya world and in the Mesoamerican world, the Nahual is actually a very intimate double. It's one you know well. You're familiar with it. You are it, right? So there's this highlighting of the relationship that one finds with oneself through the other. This is all to say that in a Maya episteme, identity is constantly translated. It's constantly changing, and it can't be fixed. So this is where we're jumping off. So let's get into the good stuff. We're going to start with Miguel Ángel Asturias. So Miguel Ángel Asturias is our first author. He was born in Guatemala City in 1899, and he would identify as Ladino. So he is Western. He's not Maya. He doesn't speak a Maya language. He speaks Spanish. He comes from a pretty well-to-do family. And like many Latin American intellectuals at the time, he gets to go to Paris. And he goes to Paris during one of the many dictatorships. And he's studying at the Sorbonne from 1923 to 1933. Now, when he's there, he writes he at least begins all 3 of sort of his quintessential pieces, which are Leyenda de Guatemala, which is his first piece, his novel El Señor Presidente, and then Hombres de Maíz. So he begins kind of writing those after he is transitioning out of Paris and going back to Guatemala. He goes back to Guatemala in 1933. And so Hombres de Maíz, which is the novel we're going to be thinking about today, was actually published in 1949, even though it was written about a decade earlier. And the reason is because when he goes back to Guatemala, he goes back to the Ubico dictatorship. And he certainly cannot publish El Señor Presidente, which is very critical of the dictatorships, nor can he publish Hombres de Maíz because it tries to value Maya cultural heritage and still live within the dictatorship. So he has to wait until this 10-year period of the 10 years of spring democratic governments to be able to publish his work, right? So that's why he doesn't publish this until 1949, and he doesn't publish El Señor Presidente until 1947. Of course, we can't forget that Asturias wins the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1967. So the question becomes, in order to understand how he deals with culture and the political moment in Hombres de Maíz, or Men of Maize, we have to ask, what's he doing in Paris? Like, what's the context of his literary work and his literary world? So first of all, French surrealism, of course, is a big influence on him. He's really drawn by the non-chronological order of time, circular time. He's interested in dreamscapes and spaces, right, in the unconscious. So he can't, like many Latin American authors, get away from French surrealism. He loves it, right? It kind of reminds him of Guatemala. He's also influenced, of course, by theories of raza cósmica, and then later he's interested in finding sort of an indigenista version of the national soul. There must be one identity, he thinks, that can describe what Guatemalanness is. And that we're going to call the national soul. And it's got to be a mix of Maya and Western culture. So that's his quest. He's looking for the singular identity, right? He's also, interestingly, studying magic, alchemy, mythology, and sacred texts in Paris. He's definitely studying Nahualismo in Paris. And he's studying the Popol Vuh, or the Quiche Maya Genesis story in Paris. Why? Well, because in the 1800s, there was a series of French anthropologists and archaeologists who ended up taking a bunch of texts and documents to Paris from Guatemala, and he finds them there. So in a sense, he discovers the Maya world in Paris, right? So let's take a look at the Popol Vuh. I want to show you a picture of the text that he finds. This is a really interesting, cool text of the Popol Vuh. It's the earliest version we have of the Popol Vuh. The Popol Vuh, what we understand of it is that it's the Quiche Maya Genesis story. It talks about how Mayas were made, how the gods made Mayas. We understand that it was a performance. It was an oral text, right? Usually aided with the assistance of glyphs. So presenters, there were usually 3 presenters or performers giving the rendition of the Popol Vuh, and you would hear them pointing in their speech to different glyphs explaining what's happening. So if you look at the Quiche side, so this is a transcription of the Quiche oral text, you see a lot of, here is da 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 da. This is when such and such a thing happens. So there are these markers of some other kind of textuality of the Popol Vuh, probably in a glyphic form, right? So a Spanish Dominican named Francisco Jimenez is working with the Quiche community, and he hears this presentation of the Popol Vuh, and he thinks, oh, is this written down? And it's not. So he decides to phonetically transcribe it into Quiche. So here on this side, we have a transcription, so moving concepts from the oral into the written, and then he translates it here into Spanish. And see why. Traducido de la lengua quiché en la castellana para más comodidad de los ministros del Santo Evangelio. Right? So that the Spaniards who are reading it are comfortable with it. So there's sort of an idea of a textual audience that needs to have this in Spanish to access it, right? So there are layers of translation already in the Popol Vuh. So what does the Popol Vuh say? Anybody who knows the Popol Vuh is going to know this is like this much, the Popol Vuh. I'll give you a breakdown. There's a creator pair, not one god, 2, a grandmother and a grandfather. And they think, it's time we create humans. Let's try it. So they have 3 tries, right? So unlike the Christian God who's just like, bang, humans, done, right? This is, okay, let's try it. We make animals, failure, because they can't talk. They can't communicate with each other because they all speak different languages. There's a Tower of Babel situation. And they can't praise the gods. So let's try again. We'll try with mud. Well, they disintegrate in the rain, so that's no good, failure. So then we'll try wood. They're too stiff. They can't move. They can't praise us because they can't speak. So that's a failure. So the grandmother and grandfather in the Popol Vuh kind of chit-chat and decide something's wrong with the world, right? We can't make these human beings, so there's some disorder in the world that needs to be fixed. So the Popol Vuh is a very circular, difficult narrative, but what eventually happens is that there's a set of hero twins, which are like a Nawal pair, right? There's a lot of twins in Mesoamerican cosmology, and a first set of hero twins goes into Earth to figure out what's wrong, and goes down into an underworld where called Shilbaba, which is characterized by sickness, death, disease, but it's not a punitive sort of Christian hell because it's necessary. We all go through it. Everybody goes through Shilbaba, and it's a matter of coming out of it, right? So the hero twins have to go there and figure out what's going on, but they're killed in Shilbaba. So then there's a second set of hero twins that comes along, and in Shilbaba are able to defeat the underworld lords, and then order is restored. And order is restored such that the sun and the moon rise, the cycle of day and night begins, and that allows for agriculture, plants to grow. And what grows? Corn. So a bunch of little ants gather the corn kernels and crawl to the original creator pair, give the creator pair the corn. They use a molino and make nixtamal and form the hombres de maíz, right? It's cool, isn't it? It's really a cool story. So this is going to come up in every single author we see, right? We're going to see a translation of this, and an adaptation and a recontextualization of this in all three of our authors. So let's look at what Asturias does with it, given the moment in time he's living in, and given his background, what he's interested in. So in Hombres de Maíz, which is also a circular, very difficult, painful text to read, there are 3 men and 3 women pairs, but order is not right in the world because all 3 women abandon their husbands. I won't make any comments about that right now. We can talk afterwards. 2 of the 3 men turn into their nawals in the novel. However, it's weird how it happens because the people who supposedly turn into the nawals are very separate from them. So there's not this idea of a duality of I am a human and a nawal at the same time. They're separate. So there's a kind of a funny conceptualization in Asturias of this concept of the nawal. One of the characters, travels to the underworld to defeat evil forces, some kind of underworld. And then at the end, all of the characters' paths converge at the coast. And on the coast, we have fertile land, we have water, we have sun, we have moon, we have the cycle of days. And all of the characters are identified as iterations of the other ones. They're all the same character, essentially. But order is restored. And so the first man who lost his wife comes back to him, and they have a bunch of kids. And the novel ends with this line. All of them, all of their children, became ants after the harvest to carry home the maize. Ants, 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 ants. Hormigas, 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 hormigas. Gracias, Asturias. Right? So we have this sort of end of the novel at the beginning of the creation, right? But we have direct pairs, right? Direct translations and adaptations to what's going on in the Popol Vuh, right? We can see the intertextuality, we can see the communication going on. But let's see how this is sort of an ambivalent, decolonial translation. I want to look at a couple of quotes. I have it in top in Spanish and in the bottom English. Don't forget that Asturias' moment in time is a huge surrealist influence and indigenismo, looking for the national soul. This quote is of one of the indigenous men, Gaspar Ilom, and he's going to war against the Ladinos, or the corn growers who are taking the indigenous land, right? So it's kind of an ambivalent decolonial translation because on the one hand, that's pretty revolutionary for the time. 1949, to have an author who's working with the government in place say, this land issue is written into our history and we have to deal with it, right? So Asturias is showing a war over natural resources, which is pretty new in Guatemalan literature at the time. However, there's a real surrealistic feel to it. So let's look at this quote because it's painful. I gotta take a deep breath. Look, Piojosa, the rockets will be starting any day now. We've got to clear the land of the lum, of the ones who knock down the trees with axes, who scorch the forest with their fires, who dam the water of the river that sleeps as it flows and opens its eyes in the pools and rots for wanting of sleep. The maize growers, the ones who've done away with the shade, for either the earth that falls from the stars is going to find some place to go on dreaming its dream in the soil of lum, or they can put me off to sleep forever. get some old rags together to tie up my things, and don't forget the cold tortillas, the salt beef, chili, all a man needs to go to war. I mean, the whole novel's like this. This is how, and in Spanish it's like even worse, right? So what's interesting about the Spanish is that you have some Maya kind of characteristics in the Spanish, but you have this sort of long repetitions, lists, right? And repeating ideas and these references to sueño and sleeping. And so what is ambivalent about this sort of reconceptualization is that it still is imagining Mayas as non-contemporary, right? Still imagining Mayas as mythical, magical, they're surreal, they're dreamlike, right? So Asturias has kind of an ambivalent take. Here I think is probably the most interesting, and I have a feeling that Cesar's going to ask me about this, given what I know about him. But I find this line in Asturias' text to be very self-referencing. Think about Asturias discovering the Maya world in Paris, going back to Guatemala and wanting to be a part of it, wanting to be identified in some way with a Maya sort of worldview, because that's part of the national soul. So what does he say? He says, the top bit in Spanish I think is prettier, so I'll read it. Uno cree inventar muchas veces lo que otros han olvidado. Cuando uno cuenta lo que ya no se cuenta, dice uno, yo lo inventé, es mío. Pero lo que uno efectivamente está haciendo es recordar. Vos recordaste en tu borrachera lo que la memoria de tus antepasados dejó en tu sangre. Which is really a beautiful quote. When I read that, I feel that there is Asturias' desire for this shared cultural patrimony that's being expressed in the novel, right? That he's remembering, he's the author, so the authorship is in his voice, in him, but it's just a memory of his own past. So there's kind of this, recolonization may be a little strong, but there's this sort of usurping of this identity in his own blood, right? This is how he views Maya. This is how he views Guatemalan-ness. It's in our blood. So we'll jump ahead 30 years. At least I'm not doing it like the Popol Vuh. Yeah, I'm going to go. So jump ahead 30 years, 1960s, 1980s. We're deep into the armed conflict years, and the left is hugely fractured, right? So we have a Marxist left on the one hand, which is like a clasista, sort of insurgency, a Marxist insurgency, and then on the other hand, and that's really centered in the city, and then on the other hand, we have a culturalist sort of insurgency or budding insurgency. Groups of Mayas who are saying the resistance isn't class-based. It is class-based. However, the primary conflict here is that our culture has been destroyed, right? So there's this sort of problem with the left, and they can't quite get it together to be a united front against the military dictatorship. It's in this period that we meet Luis de Leon, who is our next author we're going to think about today. Luis de Leon was born in 1940 in San Juan del Obispo, which is a little town outside of La Antigua, Guatemala. And it's originally a Cachiquel town, and it still is a Cachiquel town. However, it's very Latinized, which means that during the colonial period, del Obispo is there in the name of the town because the mansion of the bishop was in this town, just far enough outside the governmental sort of center, right? So that influence in this town sort of Latinized or diminished the Mayanity or expression of Mayaness in this town, so that many people don't speak Cachiquel there anymore. There were limitations on what kind of traditional dress you could wear. The religious practices were very policed, right? But people are still sort of racialized as Mayas, right? They still experience this discrimination against them as Mayas, even though they're in this sort of what they would kind of call an in-between identity, and that's really the world of Luis de Leon. So he's mixed heritage. His dad is a Ladino who was a police officer during the Ubico dictatorship. who has Maya in him but strongly denies it and hates it. Yet he's married to a Kaqchikel woman, and his De Leon's Kaqchikel mother and grandmother essentially raised Luis De Leon. However, he was able to study because his father was in the Ubika, worked for the Ubika dictatorship, and he became a rural school teacher. So in his travels, he's a traveling teacher basically, where he spends a year here, 2 years here, 2 years there. He's sent to all these small towns and Maya villages. So he kind of encounters further this Maya community of which he is part. And he really starts to identify, oh, this is like my mother, this is like my grandmother, this is who I am, right? So then he comes back to the University of San Carlos in Guatemala City, surrounded by Ladino Marxist intellectuals, and he's a literature professor. So he's in this kind of mixed space, right, where he's kind of the other, but he has the experience of both the sort of resistance groups, right? So it's a complicated space. He's also active in the Guatemalan Labor Party, and from 66 to 84, he's writing poetry. He starts with poetry, then he goes to short stories, which are absolutely brilliant, and he has one novel which was published a year after his death. He was abducted by 4 plainclothes police officers in the streets of Guatemala City in May of 1984, and about 20 years after, there were like a trove of random military papers that were found in an abandoned warehouse in Guatemala City. It was noted that he had been tortured for 3 weeks and eventually killed, right? Let's talk about his novel, El Tiempo Principia en Chihuahua. We see right away the reference to the underworld. Nathan Henney translated this novel a couple years ago as Time Commences in Chihuahua. Let's look at the story real quick. Twins, Nahuales. We have 2 pairs. We have 2 women and 2 men. Both male protagonists want to be Latinos. They're self-hating Mayas. They hate that they're Mayas. But they're clearly Mayas, and they experience racism whenever they try to leave the town. So the only safe place is the Maya town. Yet they hate it, right? Super conflicted. A totally different iteration of Maya identity in this novel. One female character is a statue of the Virgin Mary from the church. She's white, she's European looking, and she hangs out in the church, and all the men in the town are totally in love with her, right? She's kind of thought to be a vestige of the wood people creations, like all the saints that come from Europe. The statues in the churches are thought to be, oh, these are sort of part of the leftovers of this failed creation. So they become sort of sacred to Maya people who sort of consider them these leftovers from that failed creation. The other is Concha. She's a Maya woman, but she looks just like the statue, except she's Maya. And they call her La Virgen, or La Virgen de Concepcion as well. She's the Virgin of flesh and blood. But the Maya men dismiss her because she's brown. So one of these men, one day, goes crazy and robs the Virgin from the church and rapes her, which you can imagine is quite difficult given she's a wooden statue. And all the people in town go crazy and riot. There's death and destruction ensues, and the world's completely out of order. Right? So let's talk about decolonial translation in this novel and self-translation in this novel. First of all, what's interesting about the language of this text is that the Maya voice is totally different than something like an Astorias is. There's a translation of Mayaness at both the lexical and the syntactic level. So for example, just take the title as the most obvious example. We have this verb principiar, which is not a common verb for comenzar, to begin. It's an archaic term, but if you go to Guatemala and you're in villages, it's really common in sort of Maya-influenced Spanish. Principiar is normal, no? We also, and this kind of thing happens throughout the text. There are all these sort of archaic terms that are indicators of Maya-ness, right? There's also this use of complementary binaries, which I personally think is really interesting. In Maya languages, in many Maya languages, new ideas and words are formed by taking 2 terms that may be opposites, but they don't have to be. They are just sort of different in some way, and they're combined to express something in between that's untranslatable. So this happens a lot in De Leon's work. So for example, there's a story in which he's talking about an old man who is just so heartbroken that he's live, dying, die, living, living, dying, dying, living. And those words are written together. Live, dying is one word, dying, living. Right? So he's both, living and dying. So in this novel, Concha is the perfect example. There's a line, because Concha is very promiscuous, the virgin of flesh and blood, that La Virgen de la Concepción era una puta. So we have virgin for as a complementary binary, and that happens throughout the text, where there's a lack of being able to identify her exactly. She's both and she's none, she's one, she's the other at the same time. It's sort of Nahualistic, right? This is also really resistive in terms of being sort of a translation of the Popol Vuh, in that the male twins, who are also kind of Nahualistic, are Latinized Mayas, right? So we have De Leon, who's very much signaling this difficulty of even identifying any kind of Maya identity because of all the versions of it. And I think this quote is pretty indicative. If you're an Indian, maybe you don't believe in omens anymore. Before we go into it, the pichcoy is a bird that in Guatemala, in towns, Maya towns, is thought to give you, sort of tell you what's going to happen. So if you go outside and you hear the pichcoy, if it's chirping on your left, something bad's going to happen. But if it's chirping on your right, something pretty good's going to happen. So people listen for the pichcoy. So the narrator, who is very unreliable in this novel, comes in and says, if you're an Indian, maybe you don't believe in omens anymore. Maybe your head now has other ideas in it. Maybe you live in the city. Maybe you know something about the science and books. But if you're an Indian and you go back to your town and you go out at night and you hear the pichcoy sing to you, you forget your city, your books, science, your new ideas. Or maybe nothing happens to you. Maybe what happens to you is the same as any other day. So we have this authoritative narrative voice that totally is like, I don't know, maybe it's this, maybe it's not, right? So here's this playfulness in De Leon with this idea of we can't identify what Mayaness is. Why are we even trying? It's painful, right? So let's jump ahead another 30 years. In the 1990s, the Pan-Maya movement consolidates the brutality of the dictatorships lessons after about 86, and there's slowly kind of a calming down of tensions in Guatemala, and the Pan-Mayan movement consolidates and really becomes much more of a political force, mainly through the by lobbying the international community. And the armed conflict officially ends in 1996 with the peace accords. So there's some 50 constitutional amendments approved in these peace accords, and just two, some of the language in the amendments are respect for the country's multi-ethnic, pluricultural, and multilingual nature, and indigenous languages are recognized as official languages. So we have a complete redefinition of the state and what the sort of state-sponsored identity of the state is, right? So where we have Asturias and De Leon grappling with Asturias trying to fit everything into one box, and De Leon saying this isn't even possible. Now we have authors who are in this context of the nation as many different things, many different identities. So let's kind of see what one of the authors, who's a Maya Canjobal author, how we can read that new conceptualization of the nation in his text. So Daniel Caño is from Huehuetenango, which is this department. That was a very hard-hit area of Guatemala, very indigenous, very traditional. This whole sort of franja up here was really hard hit in the war. It's where the genocide mainly took place. And he grew up in that, right? He's a poet primarily. He's written some essays, but he is primarily a poet. He's also a Maya language teacher in Quetzaltenango, which is near to that area. And he writes in Canjobal, but then he translates himself into Spanish, which is not uncommon, actually, in poetry in Guatemala. There are antecedents to Daniel Caño. He's just one of sort of the younger ones that I'm looking at lately. So here's a page out of his 2011 chapbook which is called Stash no Anima, Oración Salvaje. So savage prayer. The title is in both languages. This is a poem called Man en la coque avi no estás bautizado. And we see, we'll get into the content of it in a minute, but what's interesting about it is that if page is a closed circuit, both of these identities are juxtaposed. They're like noades in a sense. They're correlated. They speak the same thing in different languages, right? So we have this juxtaposition in the textual space. And then let's look at a translation of it. We can definitely call this a decolonial translation, right? So when somebody commits an excessive act, we say in my language, man en la coque avi, you are not baptized. And this is the same as saying you're a savage. This is because the Christian conquistadors and colonizers put into the head of my ancestors that to become civilized and find God, you had to get baptized. What bullshit. Perfect, right? Decolonial, resistive, turning the narrative completely around. But yet there are these levels of translation in his bilingual text that are fascinating. So if we look at the Canjobal and we look at the Spanish, you'll notice right here, I guess there's a pointer on here I could use. You'll notice right here, Man en la coque avi, this is the title, you're not baptized. It appears in parentheses and in italics in the Spanish, but then there's a parenthetical that of course doesn't exist here because it doesn't need to, right? So you have this sort of gloss. In translation studies we'll call this a textual gloss, which is just the translation of the Canjobal. But what's important about this, I think, is that the Canjobal sort of infiltrates the Spanish, right? There's a pushing on it a little bit. Like, this is part of who you are, too, in effect. Like, I'm going to bring this into you in order for you to recognize it as foreign, right? So this is, when you see in translation studies, a source text line in the source language in the translation, we call that foreignizing, and that's there to make the reading a bit uncomfortable for the Spanish speaker in this case, because you have to confront this other that you can't access. But then the access point to it is parenthetically underneath. But what's interesting about the Canjobal is that we have the same infiltration of Spanish into the Canjobal, which isn't particularly obvious, but it is in this loan word, animalil. So it sounds like there's a connection between civilizarse and animal. But it's not animal, because L-H-I-L at the end of this word is a suffix to make a noun a verb in my languages. And so the root word is anima, like almas, like saving souls, right? That archaic sort of Spanish version of salvar animas, right? So we have this infiltration here as well as a foreignizing concept in this epistemology, right? So in some, there's a self-translation here of a speaker who's effective in both languages, who dominates both languages, who can work in both languages, and that's an identifier of both. Yet in the same space of a page is one, and we have a real decolonial translation, an explanation, pushing and resisting against sort of the standard age-old narrative. So in this project, I'm not totally ready to do conclusions, so I'll do takeaways. I want to just say that in translation studies, when we think about translation theory, we're oftentimes analyzing source text and target text and looking for problems. Like there are discrepancies between, that's not what that says, right? They should have done it this way. We're looking for the negative. But I think what we can do in this case, and in many cases, seek out the commonalities. What are the commonalities between these texts? And kind of understand translation commonalities. So all of the texts are decolonial translations or recontextualizations of Guatemalan cultural conflict in some form. They're all pretty revolutionary in their time. And they all center the Maya as the we of the text, as opposed to the Spaniards or the Criollos or the Ladinos as the we of the text. if you read about self-translation theory, of which there's not a lot, there's some authors and scholars who think about the original and the translation as twins, and they use the term twinning of text, which when I saw that, I thought, oh my God, this is perfect for Guatemala, right? So I want to we can think about these texts as twins, as nawals. Nawals speak to this concept of sort of twins. So now nawal is speaking to the two-in-one, to duality and multiplicity, as well as the potential to be both one and the other at the same time and to self-translate between, to change, right? And the potential ultimately to know oneself through experiencing the other. And so I would just end by saying that in Guatemalan literature, if we look at the vast trajectory of the genealogy of it, we're starting to see more and more recognition, both in Ladino and Maya writing, of this reality, of this conflict that ceases to be so conflictual and starts to be a little bit more celebrated. And I think as time goes on, I hope as time goes on, that will continue to happen, right, in Guatemalan literature, given this acceptance, at least on behalf of the Maya population, of being in a multicultural, plural linguistic nation. So thanks. That's it.
Thank you.